The ancient castle loomed on the edge of the cliffs, its towering spires piercing the ashen sky like the jagged teeth of some monstrous beast. Long forgotten by the world, the castle had once been a symbol of unyielding power and grandeur, but now it stood as a decaying relic, its stone walls blackened by time and the weight of countless sorrows. Grayson, Mara and Gareth had come in search of the truth behind the legends, drawn by whispers of a forgotten king and the dark power that had once held the world in its thrall. As they crossed the threshold, a chill swept through the air, carrying with it the faint scent of decay and the echo of distant cries. The castle seemed to breathe with a life of its own, its corridors winding like the twisted entrails of some long-dead creature. Shadows clung to every corner, shifting and writhing as if alive, their movements reflecting the restless spirits trapped within these walls. Grayson, ever the leader, pressed forward, his resolve unshaken by the oppressive atmosphere, while Mara and Gareth exchanged uneasy glances, their nerves already fraying. The deeper they ventured into the castle, the more it became clear that this was no ordinary place of ruin. The air was thick with malevolence, as if the very stones were infused with the essence of something ancient and evil. Grayson could feel the weight of countless eyes upon him, unseen but ever present, watching, waiting. Mara's normally sharp wit was dulled by the sense of dread that permeated every step, and even Gareth's steady demeanour wavered as the darkness closed in around them. In the heart of the castle, they discovered a grand hall, its walls lined with portraits of kings and queens long forgotten by history. But there was one portrait that drew them in, a depiction of a figure cloaked in shadow, his eyes burning with an unnatural fire. The nameplate beneath it had been scratched out, but there was no mistaking who it was. The Shadow King, the ruler who had once brought the world to its knees before being sealed away in the depths of his own domain. As they gazed upon the portrait, the air grew colder, and a low whisper seemed to emanate from the very walls, as if the castle itself was remembering. Suddenly the castle trembled, as though awakening from a long slumber. The ground beneath their feet quaked, and dust fell from the ceiling like the first drops of rain before a storm. Grayson felt a dark presence stirring, something ancient and terrible, something that had been lying in wait for centuries. The legends were true. The Shadow King was not gone, merely dormant, and their intrusion had begun to rouse him from his long sleep. With a steely determination, Grayson turned to Mara and Gareth, knowing that their journey had only just begun, and that they would need every ounce of courage to face the horrors that awaited them. The castle's malevolence grew more palpable with every step, as if it were alive, feeding on their fear. Grayson led the way through twisting corridors and ancient chambers, the flickering light of their torches casting grotesque shadows on the walls. The further they ventured, the more the air seemed to thicken with a dark energy, a force that pressed down on them, making it difficult to breathe. Mara could feel her pulse quicken, her heart pounding in her chest as they passed through rooms filled with forgotten relics and mementos of a bygone era, each one a reminder of the castle's dark past. As they descended deeper into the heart of the castle, they encountered strange and terrifying sights. Walls that seemed to bleed, whispers in languages long dead, and ghostly figures that flickered at the edge of their vision. Gareth, who had always been the most pragmatic of the group, found himself struggling to rationalize the horrors that surrounded them. The castle was not just haunted, it was a place where the boundaries between life and death, reality and nightmare, had been irrevocably blurred. The legends of the Shadow King no longer seemed like mere stories. They were a living nightmare that they had walked straight into. The group soon found themselves in a vast chamber, its ceiling lost to darkness. In the center of the room stood an ancient throne, carved from obsidian and adorned with dark gemstones that seemed to pulse with a faint malevolent light. The throne had clearly been unoccupied for centuries, yet the air around it thrummed with power. Grayson approached it cautiously, feeling a strange pull towards the throne as if it were calling to him. Mara and Gareth hung back, sensing the danger, but unable to pull their eyes away from the ominous seat of power. It was then that they heard it, a low, rumbling voice that echoed through the chamber, filling their minds with dread. "You dare enter my domain." The voice was like thunder, deep and resonant, filled with centuries of anger and hatred. The shadows in the room seemed to come alive, swirling around the throne like a storm of darkness. Grayson felt a cold hand of fear grip his heart, but he refused to back down. He had come too far to turn back now. "We seek the truth of the Shadow King," he called out, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at his insides. The shadows paused, and for a moment there was silence. Then, with a surge of dark energy, the shadows coalesced into a towering figure. A man, or at least what had once been a man, now nothing more than a being of pure darkness, his eyes glowing with an unholy light. The figure on the throne slowly rose, his form towering above them. "The Shadow King," Mara whispered, her voice trembling as the realization hit them all at once. The legends had spoken of his return, but none of them had truly believed it until now. The Shadow King had been waiting, gathering his strength, and now, with their intrusion, he was ready to reclaim his throne. Gareth, usually calm and composed, felt a surge of panic. "We have to leave," he urged, but it was too late. The doors to the chamber slammed shut with a deafening crash, trapping them inside with the Dark King himself. The shadows closed in around them, and the true battle for their lives, and perhaps their souls, was about to begin. The Shadow King towered over them, his form a shifting mass of darkness, eyes glowing with an infernal light that seemed to pierce through their very souls. Grayson tightened his grip on his sword, though he knew that no ordinary weapon could defeat such a being. The air in the chamber had grown thick and oppressive, like a living entity that sought to crush them beneath its weight. Mara and Gareth stood beside him, their faces pale but resolute as they prepared to face the terror before them. With a guttural roar that shook the very foundations of the castle, the Shadow King unleashed his power. The shadows around him surged forward, taking on nightmarish forms, twisted creatures of darkness that clawed and lashed at the trio. Grayson swung his sword in a desperate attempt to fend them off, but the blade passed through the shadows as though they were made of smoke. Mara, drawing upon her knowledge of ancient rituals, began to chant a protective spell, the words spilling from her lips in a hurried, desperate whisper. Gareth, ever the strategist, called out commands, trying to keep them coordinated in the face of overwhelming odds. Despite their efforts, the power of the Shadow King was too great. The shadows overwhelmed them, driving them back towards the walls of the chamber. Grayson could feel the cold tendrils of darkness wrapping around him, sapping his strength and filling his mind with despair. The Shadow King's voice echoed in his mind, promising eternal torment, the fall of all light, and the rise of a new era of darkness. But even in the face of such horror, Grayson refused to yield. He knew that if they were to have any chance of stopping this ancient evil, they had to find the source of his power. "The throne!" Mara cried out, her eyes wide with realization. The throne was the key, the source from which the Shadow King drew his strength. It had been his seat of power in life, and it was now the anchor that bound him to this world in death. But reaching it was another matter entirely. The shadows swirled around the throne, a tempest of darkness that seemed impenetrable. Grayson nodded to Mara and Gareth, a silent agreement passing between them. This was their only chance. With a final surge of determination, Grayson broke free from the shadows that ensnared him. He charged towards the throne, the air around him growing colder with every step. Mara and Gareth followed, using the last of their strength to hold off the Shadow King's minions. As Grayson reached the throne, he raised his sword high, aiming for the dark gemstones that pulsed with malevolent light. With a cry that echoed through the chamber, he brought the blade down with all his might, shattering the stones. For a moment, everything went still. The shadows froze, the air grew deathly quiet, and the glow in the Shadow King's eyes dimmed. But the victory was short-lived, for as the throne shattered, the entire castle began to tremble violently, as if the very foundations of the world were unraveling. As the obsidian throne shattered, the chamber erupted in chaos. The once solid ground trembled violently, sending cracks spidering across the floor and up the walls. The shadows that had swirled so malevolently around the Shadow King dissipated into the air like smoke, and for a fleeting moment, it seemed as though the nightmare had ended. Grayson stood breathless, his sword still raised, his heart pounding in his chest. But the sense of victory was short-lived. A deep rumble echoed through the castle, as if the very stones were groaning in agony. The Shadow King, though weakened, was far from defeated. His form flickered like a dying flame, but his eyes burned with renewed fury. "Fools!" his voice hissed through the air, more chilling than ever. "You have only sealed your own fate." As he spoke, the darkness around him began to coalesce once more, not in the form of shadows, but as a palpable, seething mass of pure malevolence. It spread outwards, engulfing the room, the castle, and beyond, as if it were a living entity seeking to consume everything in its path. Gareth, realizing the magnitude of what was happening, grabbed Mara's arm and pulled her towards the chamber's entrance. "We have to get out of here," he shouted over the roar of the collapsing structure. But as they turned to flee, the doors that had once trapped them inside now stood open, revealing a world beyond that had changed irreparably. The sky, once overcast and bleak, was now an abyss of swirling blackness, and the ground trembled with the force of something immense and unstoppable rising from the depths. Outside the castle, the world was already succumbing to the Shadow King's power. The dark energy unleashed by the shattering of the throne had spread like wildfire, corrupting everything it touched. Trees withered and died, the earth cracked open, and the very air seemed to buzz with dark magic. Mara stared in horror as the once familiar landscape transformed into a twisted nightmare. The realization hit her like a physical blow. They hadn't stopped the Shadow King. They had unleashed him. Grayson, Mara, and Gareth stood at the castle's threshold, watching as the world around them was consumed by darkness. The Shadow King, now a force of nature rather than a mere being, had become something far greater and more terrible than they could have imagined. Their attempt to destroy him had only served to accelerate his return, and now, with his power unchecked, he would reign over a world shrouded in eternal night. Grayson's heart sank as he realized the gravity of their failure. There was no going back, only forward into the abyss that they had unwittingly unleashed. The once vibrant world had fallen into ruin, a shadow of its former self. The skies remained an eternal night, devoid of stars or moon, an abyssal void that stretched endlessly across the horizon. The land, once fertile and green, was now a desolate wasteland where nothing grew, and the wind carried with it the whispers of the dead. Grayson, Mara, and Gareth, battered and broken, stood amidst the devastation, the realization of their failure weighing heavily upon them. The world they had known was gone, replaced by a realm of darkness where the Shadow King reigned supreme. In the days that followed, the few remaining pockets of resistance were swiftly crushed. The Shadow King's power was absolute, his reach extending far beyond the borders of the ancient castle. Those who tried to fight back were consumed by the darkness, their souls feeding the ever-growing abyss. Grayson could only watch in despair as the world he had fought so hard to protect crumbled before his eyes. His once strong and determined spirit was now burdened with guilt and sorrow, knowing that their actions had only hastened the inevitable. Mara, her resolve shattered, wandered the barren landscape in a daze, searching for some sign of hope in the endless night. But there was none to be found. The light had been extinguished, and the darkness was all-consuming. Gareth, ever the strategist, had tried to formulate a plan, a way to undo what had been done, but even he knew that it was too late. The Shadow King was no longer just a man, but a force of nature, an embodiment of the darkness that now ruled the world. There was no stopping him, no reversing the damage that had been done. As the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, the trio found themselves isolated in a world that no longer had a place for them. The The Shadow King's influence was everywhere, a constant reminder of their failure. The land itself seemed to rebel against them, as if it too had been corrupted by the dark magic that now flowed through it. Grayson, Mara, and Gareth knew that they could not remain in this world much longer, but the question of where to go and how remained unanswered. In the end, it was Grayson who made the decision. "We must leave this world," he said, his voice hollow and devoid of hope. "There is nothing left for us here." And so, they began their preparations, gathering what little they could in the hopes of finding a way to escape the Shadow King's dominion. But as they stood on the edge of the world, staring into the void that had consumed everything they had once known, they realized that there was no escape. The darkness was everywhere, and it would follow them wherever they went. The Shadow King had won, and his reign would continue unchallenged until the end of time.